podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
Hello and welcome to another Issues of Food Truths. I'm your host, Eric Schulze. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today's guest is Dr. Sydney Schreppler, and she's the Director of Product and R&D at Savor, a company making delicious, high-performing, and sustainable fats. Sydney is a physicist by training, with a PhD from UC Berkeley and a background in quantum computing and atomic physics. We get deeply into that aspect of how does a quantum physicist actually get into food science and why that's so important and interesting. Seeking to make opportunities that make meaningful contributions to climate change mitigation, Dr. Schreppler joined Savor to help engineer a truly scalable food system and develop delicious fats designed molecule by molecule. Our discussion today ranges in scale from obviously the smallest, the quantum, to the molecular, to our foods, and how one actually designs foods from the molecule up. It's a fascinating conversation today here on Food Truth, so please, and help me welcoming Dr. Sydney Schreppler of Savor. I always love to interview folks who are professional scientists on this show, and today, my very first quantum physicist is here, Dr. Sydney Schreppler. She's the Director of Product Research and Development at Savor, and she's going to talk about food science. You do, in fact, have the right show, and I guarantee you want to stick around for this conversation. Like myself, Sydney here started out in a very different scientific field and has migrated over to food. And in many ways, this can help us discover better food. So first off, Sydney, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about food.
So, okay. First off, you're a quantum physicist, and you worked on quantum computing. Now, I am familiar with the concept. I think I know some of it, but I think it would be great to just anchor to what is quantum computing in a nutshell? Why science as a career? And how the hell did that get you to food?
It isn't an obvious path. I agree. Quantum computing in a nutshell is trying to solve problems that typical computers, even the most powerful computers we can build, can't solve, even if you let them run for the age of the universe. And so physicists, and now many other types of scientists, are working on using quantum phenomena to build new computers to solve those problems. And there's a lot of really exciting work in it. As you said, I worked in quantum computing for quite a while. I'm a physicist by training, and it's about solving these far-off problems. It's about speculating about what building new technologies could do for you, even if you aren't entirely sure what the technology will look like. And it's much, much less tangible than what you happen to be eating as a snack in the laboratory while you're trying to build your quantum computer. So as you said, I worked in quantum computing for quite a while. And at some point, I was thinking about the timelines of the results that I was likely to see. And I love contributing to furthering human knowledge. That's one of the reasons I got into science. But I was worried about whether or not the quantum computing research I was doing was targeting the very real problems that the world is facing in my lifetime. And so I started to cast about for an opportunity to work on something related to climate change, which is rapidly becoming something that isn't just a far out problem with hypothetical warming of the planet happening in generations to come. It's contributing to changes in seasons every year of my life. In casting about for some sort of research and contribution I could do to climate change, I actually landed on food because, maybe surprisingly to a lot of us, and myself included at the time, the food we eat is a huge contributor to our species' impact on the planet. Whether it's the animals we raise for food, whether it's the crops we raise for food, whether it's the transportation and production. And so I came to this startup called Savor in California that is trying to make fats and oils as part of the food system in the most climate efficient way possible. And I've been learning along the way how I can apply my physics skills to something as different from quantum computing as as I can think of, honestly, right now.
Well, we're going to get to, I think, a little bit more of this idea of the orthogonal approach to science, or these things that you learn elsewhere, that bits and pieces or concepts end up being very important for innovation in a completely unrelated field. Um, and it sounds like that's true. One sort of small question I always had that I feel like I can ask you here is, there are certain types of problems that quantum computers are better for, correct, than traditional computers, and there are conventional computers, and then there are tasks that a conventional computer is better at. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's certainly fair to say. And to elaborate on that, the original idea for a quantum computer, I mean, it came from a lot of people, but a real father of the idea was Richard Feynman, who, to paraphrase him, said, you know, if you have a quantum problem that you need to solve, then the computer better be quantum, damn it, because it's just too difficult to simulate quantum phenomena with a regular computer. So one thing that we are certain of is a problem that has quantum mechanics in it. And that can include drug discovery. It can include developing new molecules and chemistries for a lot of different things, maybe even the food system. Um, when you're talking at the molecular level, quantum matters. And when quantum matters, you actually do need a quantum computer often. Sometimes approximations are good enough. So that's where we're confident that quantum computers can help. There's a whole bunch of problems where we're not that confident. And actually, it's quite related to the rise of artificial intelligence as an interesting technology that we're all discussing, and we're not entirely sure where artificial intelligence is going to win compared to other ways of problem solving. Quantum computing has a lot of parallels. So I think it's valid maybe someday in my life to ask me, and how could you apply a quantum computer to this food science problem? I don't have an answer today.
I feel like we're going to know some sense of the answers to that sooner rather than later. And I agree. You don't always know where the research is going to lead or when it will become important, if at all. I think two things. Richard Feynman, I also love what he attributed to him. If anyone that claims to understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand quantum mechanics, which I feel is like a very probabilistic thing to say. Um, and and also, we just don't know where some of this work will go. I couldn't tell you where cultivated meat, what, when it first started, when we first started doing science, what was going to become important. The things that I definitely thought were going to be important were not. um and I'm curious, now that you're designing fats and for use in foods, I'm curious how you're seeing, like, and we'll get to this, but I'd love to hear a little bit about what has been sort of surprisingly important, that you've pulled from your career thus far, or in some of the learnings you've gotten so far from doing this work.
Um, I will say that one of the things I try to avoid is there's a bit of a stereotype of physicists coming to other fields and bullying their way in, saying, well, you know, I can do field X better than the people who've dedicated their whole careers to this. So I'm cognizant of that, and I always try to come in ready to learn. That said, the questions that I tend to ask when I'm learning are with a physicist lens, and that lens has led me to learn a lot about fats and oils and how um, it's the physical properties more than the components that actually matter a lot for your enjoyment of a food. Um, the interesting thing is that human enjoyment is now the instrument that I have to use to measure my success in my scientific endeavor. In the past, it's been electrical signals, it's been laser beams, it's been mass spectrometry, uh, and now often it's someone's experience of the volatilization of flavor that comes from getting the fat melt just right. But what I've learned in this is we, in the field of oleoscience, we've often talked about what something is made of when we talk about replicating it or improving on it. But actually, if you drill down, I'm learning it's less about what something is made of, and it's more about what the physical properties like the melting behavior or the viscosity or some of these things that I actually am trained to detect. It's those that really influence the success of a product you're trying to develop for the food space.
So Savor produces triglycerides, which, for those of you that may not know, are the precursors to many of the fats that we eat every day. And then you transform them further into familiar favorites like butter, for example. Could you just briefly talk about how you do this? And then, of course, any detail you have about this, because I think most people probably don't interact or think about triglycerides very often, but I'm sure you spend a lot of time doing so.
Every day, every hour of every day. Yes. So uh, triglycerides, and before coming to the field of fats and oils as a profession, my experience and many other people's experience of triglycerides is something in your broad blood panel that your doctor tells you you need to lower because you had a burrito right before the blood test. True. So the reason that triglycerides are measured in your blood is that a triglyceride is just the very simple molecule, as you say, that underlies all fats and oils. It's three fatty acids, tri, attached to one glycerin backbone, glyceride. Um, and what Savor does is Savor makes those fatty acids and attaches them to the glycerin backbone. This is the same thing that animals do, that plants do. So when you drink whole milk, when you um, pour vegetable oil into your wok, um, those are primarily the fat in the milk, the oil and the vegetable oil are primarily triglycerides. And Savor is making triglycerides too. Um, and we are just doing it rather than using an animal or a plant, we're using a chemical reaction. Triglycerides are really simple molecules. They're just chains of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. You don't actually need a degree in organic chemistry to see that they're pretty simple. And but what you do need a degree in organic chemistry for is to figure out just the right chemical reaction that takes carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens and forms them. Or you have to be a plant or an animal. It turns out we as humans also make triglycerides. It's in our fat too. So why would Savor want to do this chemically when you can use, a canola plant to make canola oil? Well, it's because we were searching for the way to um, find the most climate efficient replacement in the food system. And what we found is that there are a ton of sources of carbon that are begging to be used for something that humanity needs. There's captured carbon dioxide is a fascinating technology that we're developing right now in the sustainability space. There's waste methane, there's green hydrogen. And Savor as a company takes those various sources of the building blocks of fatty acids, forms them into fatty acids and forms them into forms them into fatty acids and forms them into triglycerides. Um, at the end of the day, those triglycerides, they're the same uh, molecularly as what's made from plants and animals. So I want to be clear that they're not a fat replacement for a diet. They're just triglycerides. So it's helpful to understand, as I have come to, that fat is a very simple molecule.
So in the cultivated space, I think there's the climate cultivated meat, for example. A lot of reasons we do it is because we think we can reduce or ameliorate or even reverse certain climate change trends. As well, I think there's specific use cases where, for example, like making cultivated beef is like in terms of just like greenhouse gas emissions is a huge win if you can do it. And then water usage, there's just like specific cases. It sounds like for the triglyceride generation, part of this is there's just like we've always sort of relied on plants and animals to make this in for commercial products, and this is a way to sort of address climate, potentially do it at scale that's cheaper than an animal, raising animals. I assume that's part of it, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely. And I'll add a number to your instinct there.
Please.
We've actually calculated that 7% of human contributed greenhouse gas emissions come from the fats and oils that we eat or otherwise use in cosmetics. 7% is a huge number. It feels wrong until you understand just how much food it takes to feed a planet of billions. So
That's what half of on the lower end of animal contributed greenhouse gas emissions, something like that.
something,
That's
yeah,
that is a large amount. That is
yeah,
incredibly large.
it's huge. It's huge. I mean, it's what got me to go and work for this company. I don't think I had anywhere close to that number in my head, and I would have said, well, like, yeah, but who needs to make fats and oils? We should be focusing on wind energy. And the answer is we should be, but just to set your perspective there, 7% of greenhouse gas emissions means anyone who can be looking for an opportunity to make a scalable solution that is more efficient than plants and animals should be. So I agree with you. Like cultivated, our chemical process, pretty much I come around to anyone who can be contributing should be. Um, and
Subtle plug if you're listening.
subtle
Get into
plug,
this field. We need more we need more shots on goal.
we do. We do. And in terms of scalability, that is increasingly an important metric for the likelihood for success. Is that we need a solution faster than my timeline for building a quantum computer. And so the reason Savor is focusing on chemistry rather than some of the other solutions that have come to the fore, and you see other companies focusing on for not just fats and oils, but other macronutrients. Savor is focusing on chemistry because we get to take advantage of a huge body of human knowledge around chemical engineering. Chemical engineering is a field where we can scale up processes from the benchtop to world scale rapidly. And what it means is that we feel like we have a path to take a process that a couple years ago was making ounces of oil to thousands of tons. In my lifetime, should be shorter than my lifetime because it needs to be to matter. But I will caveat that with we're focusing, as I said before, on triglycerides, which are very simple molecules. And so we found a path to scale with these simple triglycerides. That's only part of the human nutritional landscape. It's one macronutrient. So again, a plug to the listeners. This is why we need lots and lots of solutions that scale, because there's proteins, there's fiber, there's so many other factors of the human diet. That said, we hope that Savor's model for triglycerides can be a good model for finding other chemical solutions because of the inherent scalability there.
Hmm. So, if you can, just briefly, like, what are the inputs to producing triglycerides? Like, take our listeners through very briefly how this is done. Like, what does it take to do this?
Absolutely. So I started my training is actually in atomic physics originally. So I started with the atoms
As
to be
one does.
as one does. I started with the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen. Um, but really, what our building blocks at Savor are chains of carbons and hydrogens that can be produced through a number of processes that are already well scaled. And those chains of carbons and hydrogens, they can come from a couple places. So we have partners who are creating those chains of carbons and hydrogens from captured carbon dioxide. This is, excitingly a really, really sustainable option as an input. You'd love to be capturing that carbon dioxide that would otherwise be going up and contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions and then take it and eat it. That said, it's a relatively nascent field, the captured carbon dioxide field. And so, we're trying to grow alongside it. But the great thing about our technology is it can take other forms of carbon as well as an input. Other forms, including, for example, captured methane. And so there are a lot of sources of methane around the world. And we can be open to taking any of those inputs. At Savor, what we do is we take a very close look at the life cycle analysis, basically the effective sustainability numbers or carbon footprints, depending on our feedstock, depending on our process. And we try to take into account that sometimes, you would love direct air capture of carbon dioxide, but it's just not available yet. So we compare, if we have a captured methane source, what do our numbers look like compared to, a beef cow? It's an important number to consider. So yeah, what you'll see in the coming year or so from Savor is fat coming from captured carbon dioxide and from captured methane. We'll have both of those available, and we then work with our customers to figure out what makes the most sense for them.
What would you say? I'm not trying to be cheeky. What would you say to those that would say we have carbon capture devices? They're called plants.
I would say it's really cool how plants do that carbon capturing, and the careful accounting that can be difficult is what are all of the other factors that go into growing a plant and turning it into food? Um, and the fact of the matter is, for some kinds of food and for some kinds of plants, they are very efficient carbon capture machines, and they're very good at making the nutrients that we need. And for others, they're actually not that efficient, particularly if you take into account the fact that we actually have to cut down forests to increase our production. Um,
Hmm.
Palm oil is a terrific example where it also matters where in the world you're growing the palm. If you're growing it in the Amazon compared to, in the equatorial belt in Southeast Asia, there are differences that we've learned in the general environmental impact. Um, and there is a good and healthy debate among academics and others about how you do that accounting. It's not a settled thing to say this is exactly how much palm oil costs in terms of your carbon footprint. So, what I would say is, I, as a scientist, am always open to someone telling me this plant is a better carbon capture to food machine than you can build. And that's always the challenge for me. I should not be in this business if I can't build a machine that's better than the plant.
And that's what makes you a good scientist. I I've got a version of this question regarding sort of like any new food technology that challenges an incumbent system. And again, nothing wrong with incumbent systems. I agree. They have their place in the food supply. I always, though, I feel this is a failure of imagination that we could not discover or invent something that's more efficient than the plant. Like, why can't like that unless that is explicitly forbidden by the laws of physics? I'm a David Deutschian in that sense. Like, it's possible. It's just might be very hard or very expensive or we require knowledge we haven't discovered yet. But I fundamentally believe we can recapitulate all the ingredients in our food products that we consume through a brand new version of production like you're doing. I don't have a reason to believe that's not possible. It sounds like you're also the same way. Um, and are there any unique challenges with like fats and triglyceride production that maybe aren't present for say like protein production that make it particularly hard or maybe particularly easy?
Mm. Um, well, I can start with what's particularly easy. Um, what's particularly easy is that compared to proteins, I think of fats as much simpler molecules. Um, and so the founders of my company, they kind of came to conviction. This was before I came and worked at Savor, that you could replicate what plants are doing with producing fats through a chemical process. The same conviction is more difficult with proteins. So I will say that kind of simpler molecules, simpler processes.
Hmm.
Um, And I see that as not an insurmountable obstacle for other macronutrients. It's just we're starting with the easy one. What is harder for fats and oils actually, puts me in mind of so protein is a really hot macronutrient these days. It's hard to convince someone that more protein in their diet is a bad thing. I would say if you're walking around on the street, based on what people are reading. Fat has a checkered history. I grew up in the low-fat '90s in America,
Same.
and yep, and I think there's an evolution in our collective understanding of the nutrition of fat, but it's still very hesitant. Um, so a hurdle that we have if we're a fats and oils company is that we have a nutrition question that I think maybe protein companies don't quite need to address as closely. Um, what you were saying about, optimistically believing, look, we should be able to do anything that plants can do. We should be able to synthesize it, replicate it. What I would challenge is I agree with you, and nutrition and human diet is so complicated from my perspective as a physicist. There's so many matrix effects. There's so many cross interference terms in anything I would try to model that I don't know yet what we should try to do, even if we had all the tools to make each molecule, because I don't understand for some foods that we understand to be healthy what it is about them that's healthy. And I suspect that anyone who tells you they know exactly what it is about them that's healthy is selling you a oversimplified story. So I would wish for more science to help inform what it is we should be trying to make, because the macronutrients on their own are not enough.
I had one of my former bosses at FDA. She was uh, her name Dr. Susan Main, who was the head of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at FDA, like head food division, and she's a nutritionist by training, in her PhD. And she would also, that was her main point, is like, we just don't. She was like, we know more than we have, but we don't have like the rigor that you could study in physics, for example. It's just not there for nutrition. Um, and Pat Brown, founder of Impossible, I had him on the show, and he was a bit more blunt. He was just like, nutrition science is garbage, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but he believed that like we really need to sort of start a do-over. I think somewhere in there's actually reality, which is what, like you say, like a more deliberate, invested approach into like the matrix effects of nutrition, longer term study. It's really hard to study it though, as you know,
And expensive.
because expensive, and testing on humans is understandably heavily regulated, and we don't have a very good proxy for the human diet or in terms of an animal model. So I agree, but I also think fats have gotten the short end of the stick unfairly. But and I want to use this as a way to get into fats as flavor, because fat is, it is in many ways the flavor driver. It is the unique flavor of foods, is often derived from directly or indirectly from fats. Um, I'm I'm curious. One, is that true in your expert opinion? And sort of maybe like what, maybe a little fats in flavor sensory analysis 101 for our listeners around like what fat does for food.
I have learned that too. And what I have learned is that fat contributes to flavor in a couple ways. And again, this is as a newcomer to the sensory science and fat field. I've learned that fat is a flavor carrier. Just the kind of material and the kind of molecule it is. If you have flavorful molecules in your food, they will come along for the ride into your mouth in the fat in a way that they might not necessarily in like the water part of the food or the dry part. So that's part of it. You need somewhere for the flavor to be captured and sitting and not, float off in your pantry. Um, and related to that, if you've got flavor molecules and they're hanging out in the fat, and then you put that bit of butter in your mouth, to use an example that we think about a lot at Savor, um, the flavors are getting released as the fat is melting in your mouth. And so your experience of the flavor, which is really the whole point of flavor, is your experience of it, right? Is going to be colored, tempered, adjusted by the fat itself. So as a neophyte in flavor and sensory, I've learned about, temporal impacts of flavor and where it's released in your mouth and on your palate, and all of these are impacted by the fat system. Whether it's a liquid oil, whether it's a very hard tallow, those things will, if you have the same flavor profile in each, you will experience it totally differently. And then there's a third component of fat as a flavor delivery that I've been exploring more recently, and gets into some fun biology, frankly, which is the fatty acids themselves that make up the triglycerides. They themselves have flavor. Triglycerides are relatively inert molecules. For the most part, they don't break up as you're eating them, but there are a couple mechanisms that do pull those fatty acids off. Some of those fatty acids smell so much like goat that you walk into our lab, and if you don't like goat cheese, heaven help you, because it's going to be a bad day for a lab tour. So how do those fatty acids break off? They can break off in a fermentation process. If you're making like a yogurt or a cheese, they get liberated by some of the little biological microbial processes. They can also break off due to some enzymatic interactions in your mouth, as I understand, as I'm coming to learn. And so you can get flavor directly from the fat if you have the right fatty acids. Some fatty acids aren't that flavorful. Some are potent.
Correct me if I'm wrong. There's one called caprylic acid, right?
Oh, there's a whole family. There's caproic, caprylic, uh, and capric.
Right.
Yes. So,
With the from the root word for goat, basically.
exactly. Yeah. So you were
Uh,
warned. If you knew your
I my
Latin.
favorite my favorite little fun fact about some of these fatty acids and their effect on human like sensory is, um, humans we don't have a particularly good scent compared to say something like a dog, except a few places. And one of them is for the smell of fresh water, geosmin, which we can detect in like a 1 part in a billion compared to most animals. And then the other one, which is butyric acid. And we
Mm,
have, and I'm sure you're very familiar with the, and obviously in like very low amounts, butter, right? But in high amounts, it's the smell of vomit.
that's right.
Um,
And sour beers that you haven't quite nailed it on.
that's right. And so I love this idea that like the dose determines the poison, basically in fatty acids.
Yes.
Um, Also, when I was working in cultivated products, I used to tell my team when we were designing that, and could you speak to this a little bit? The role of the people, like we think about intramuscular fat, we look at subcutaneous fat. You were mentioning like tallows and hard fats. I do a lot of smoking meats. You have hard fat, soft fats. Um, but also, people forget that the cell membranes themselves are literally made out of phospholipids. And I contend that those directly contribute to the very species specific flavor of different proteins. But I was wondering if that had any weight from y'all's research or anything that y'all were working on, like the role of the cell membrane potentially in flavor development.
Mm. Um, so I want to speak to the food side, and then since we're sharing fun stories, and you mentioned the human ability to smell fresh water, I'm gonna tangent on another fun story. Uh, we we are right now focusing as a company on bulk fats. The kind of the fats that you get uh, in a jar or a stick in the grocery store. But that said, again, to the matrix effect, to the whole food effect, not just from a nutrition perspective, but a sensory perspective, I agree with you. I think the permeability of the cell membrane and the ability to allow for kind of the escape of either nutritional or flavorful molecules it has to matter. It has to be the difference between something that's been, pureed or autoclaved or somehow disrupted, and the kind of whole foods and beautifully marbled beef that we get so much enjoyment out of, that has this like really elegant and fascinating structure to it. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'd love to, as a company, I think we would look to be, Savor would look to be working with the folks making the proteins and working with the folks trying to encapsulate their foods in certain ways to try to build that structure back the way nature does it. The fun tangent story I wanted to share about cell membranes, and this is something that our team has been learning from uh, evolutionary biologists and others more recently, is this chemical process to make fatty acids that we've been pursuing. It feels random. It feels like just something, oh, you can just take carbon and make fatty acids with relatively simple processes at scale. What we've been learning is that there are some hypotheses that the very origins of cell membranes on Earth come about because of the same chemical process that we're using. So we talk about this as a novel way to make fats, but it might actually be the original way to make fats. The thesis, and I would have to get you the name of the researcher after the fact. The thesis is that in deep sea hydrothermal vents, where we think of this sort of primordial soup coming into existence at the beginning of life on this planet, there were carbons and hydrogens and oxygens and the kind of environmental effects of heat and relative pH that allowed for the formation of these fatty acids. And then you had protocells, the sort of precursors to cells that were starting to assemble and form cell membranes, and then begin the process of replication. And all of this is arguably possible because you have this lipid based permeable membrane around a cell. So the very cool chemistry is trying to think up, how do you get lipids as like the building block of life? And it looks a lot like what we're doing right now to make butter, frankly.
So, if one wants to make cultivated or cultured or however you want to refer to it butter, first one must create the universe, to quote Carl Sagan. We basically need to invent. We need to go back to where it began. Um,
Of course, to put it simply.
to put it simply, yeah, this is for those listening. It's easy. Like you just have to go back and figure out exactly how life started in order to make fat um, in a more efficient way.
Mhm.
I know we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but like, what has surprised you the most? Having come into, you talked about sort of the structure rather than the componentry of fat that was really important. What do you wish more folks would know about fat when they're shopping for food? Like, what's the thought process you think they should have that maybe is sort of myth busting on your part?
Well, a big one, again, for those of us who came of age in the 90s, is that if you subtract the fat from a food, you're gonna have to find a way to put things back in to make you want to eat it. And I think we've been on a slow trajectory as a society, particularly in the US, to learning that. But what I've learned is fat does so much for you with so little, that when you subtract it from a food, you're adding back in the structural element, you're adding more flavor to compensate, and you're still missing something, frankly, and you're still hungry afterward. So, what I wish that shoppers of my generation knew was that fat's not the enemy. It's actually a very efficient way to get a food that you like to eat, um, and that, as I said earlier, that fats and oils, they're wonderful. They're really good in food, and they're a huge contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. Which doesn't mean we should stop eating them. It means we should be focusing our research efforts on how to continue to enjoy food at the same level we always have, uh, without having to subtract them.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that science is often posited as sort of the instigator of the apocalypse or some dystopian nightmare in sci-fi, but I think the reality is that science is often the bridge to the future. It's like and the bridge to our traditions. Like I want to keep eating butter. Is this a way to do so? And then I don't feel like I don't have to we don't have to rely on as many animals. Great. I'm all in. Um, so I see this as sort of like, thank goodness science is figuring this out. I had a question though related to this is I don't I don't I don't know if can you alter the nutritional profile of these products in any meaningful way that would be useful? It is, butter is a saturated fat, for example, and they're not bad inherently. But I was wondering, like, is there a way to alter it in a way so it's functionally the same but has a different nutritional profile? I don't even know if that's possible or if that's a goal, or is it just direct, replication of what comes out of an animal?
Um, it's a question we get a lot. It's a question we get all the time, and it's related to, if you have this amazing toolbox, why not try to also make it better? Make it better for the planet, make it better for the people. Um, to start with, we are focused on matching what we see in nature nutritionally. But there are opportunities to improve on it. And that's actually why I would love more nutrition science to help tell us how exactly we should improve on it. Um, there's a lot of science around, depending on the fatty acid, how individuals metabolize it. And so what that means is not all saturated fats are created equal. The long chain saturated fats, for example, that you get in a beef tallow, they can contribute more to some of the negative health effects that we think of for saturated fat consumption. But then there are these medium chain saturated fats that appear, for example, in coconut oil that you metabolize quite differently. So there are opportunities for us to play around, mix and match there, and try to get at the right balance of the energetic properties of fat. Fat is a tremendous source of energy for humans, while trying to mitigate some of the kind of long-term chronic health impacts. Some of that is saturated, unsaturated. Some of it is which fatty acids you're including. And then there's the whole field that I want to say is distinct from what we do at Savor, which is replacing triglycerides entirely with something that gives you, a mouth sensation of a fat but isn't a fat. That is not something we're focused on. We're focused on triglycerides as a macronutrient, much the way animals and plants make them. Um, and so we do draw that distinction. And incidentally, that's one of the reasons why it's easier for us to kind of bring these new products to market, is because they are triglycerides. And so from a nutritional and regulatory standpoint, it's not a new food. It's a new process of making a food.
So that with that in mind, where is oleoscience today? Like, first off, I think people now maybe have a grasp of the basics, but where's the research focusing that you're seeing? And again, sort of the surprising lines of inquiry that could potentially be a great business for someone listening who, that you'd be like, oh, I wish to get some funding and start this up.
Um, we talk a lot about oleoscience in our company. We have these sort of sci-fi lunch chats sometimes about, what would you do if you could? Um, where we think oleoscience is, that's very exciting, that we hope to contribute to, is, for a long time, oleoscience was about taking the fats nature gave you and kind of fractionating them, or just dividing them a little bit, getting the uh, hard and soft palm fractions, and then doing what you could with that. Oleoscience is starting to be about building from the bottom up rather than the top down. So this idea that we pursue at Savor, we're not alone in it, building something fatty acid by fatty acid towards a desired goal. What would you do if you had all the piano keys to play with, instead of just the black keys or just the white keys? And there, to go back to our very beginning of our conversation about what's the technology going to do for you, you maybe don't know yet, but you can speculate. So this is why you're building this computer. Um, I don't think we know yet all the things that we can do when we have a full piano of combinations of fatty acids that we can make. We're starting to speculate. You can get the folks who make chocolate are terribly clever in the field of oleoscience. Um, and we can see them adjusting crystallization behavior. We can see them inhibiting bloom. Start to apply that kind of thinking to everything you eat that has fat in it. And you'll see that actually with just adjusting the fatty acids, you can make whole new things that are more shelf stable, or they have a surprising texture or a different flavor profile from what you've ever found in nature. So it's just all about changing your engineering perspective from a top down to a bottom up.
What's the hardest part about changing that mentality? I feel like it's really important. I agree. I think it's hard for people to do this or know that they're doing, for example, top down versus first principle reasoning. Like what's an easy way to sort of get someone to rethink that approach?
Yeah, it's hard because they don't always realize, as you say, that they're
Mhm.
thinking in that way. So if I'm talking to, a company that makes chocolate, for example, they'll often give me their desired product in terms of the existing product and ingredient landscape that they have access to. They'll say, what I want is I want, uh, you know, a mix of shea butter and palm oil that does this. Um, and so, can you make me that exact mix of palm oil and shea butter? To which I then have to say, actually, tell me about what the behavior in the chocolate bar needs to be. Tell me about, is it melting? Is it viscosity? Is it crystallization? Is it snap? Just give me a little bit more to work on, because there's the possibility that from bottom up we can actually get to better than what your very carefully developed combination of palm oil and shea butter can do. And this is where I have to be careful, because I certainly don't want to be in the business of telling the chocolate people how to do what they do. They're very smart. Um, but it is a mindset shift. And fortunately, I found you just have to have, one extra conversation to start to get people thinking along those lines and really excited to actually build something new with you.
I found what works is focusing on we dividing the conversation into what fat is or what chocolate is, and then having the what chocolate can be or what fat
Mhm.
can be. And that forces people to then go, wait, okay, it doesn't have to fit into some prescribed existing paradigm, that freedom to explore. And it sounds like that's what you're doing as well.
It's what makes the
Um,
conversations fun for me.
you've mentioned in our last few minutes, I wanted to talk about mentioning that you wanted to see the benefits of your work before you die. And I agree, I'm with you. Some folks would argue, though, that our work as scientists, as professional scientists, is planting trees in which you will never know the shade. And I suspect you can do both. You can plant and enjoy. Why do you feel this approach is maybe less common than what I would say the more deferred progress or delayed gratification approach that a lot of scientists seem to have, or what we're trained with? I think your viewpoint in this is particularly interesting.
Because I have gotten to do both. Um, I, was very privileged to get to work on fundamental research without a direct consumer application, for example, over the course of my degree. Um, and now I am, very urgently trying to focus my work on where I think I can make the most impact for a problem that is accelerating. Um, I don't think it's a dichotomy, because every day we make decisions in our lab at Savor about whether a particular problem is a problem for today, a problem for next year, or a problem for 10 years from now. And if it's a problem for 10 years from now, it doesn't mean we don't tackle it today. It just means that we figure out which part of the lab to work on it in. We see ourselves as scientists, as contributors to the general human knowledge base and to the solutions of the future. And also, we have this urgent mission to make the most impact we can right now, which is why if you come to me tomorrow and say this plant is a better carbon to food machine than you can make, I would say, great, I'm going to stop everything and I'm going to go try to make that plant better. So I mean, it sounds oversimplified to say, oh, we work on both. It's a really hard decision every day, because sometimes I see a certain thing like, fats and oils are 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. There's all these other chunks of greenhouse gas emissions. Shouldn't I also be working on those? Um, and sometimes what that means is if I think I can make a little bit of incremental progress on understanding a solution to target other parts of the pie, I'm either trying to figure out if that fits within Savor's mission, or if I can be contacting others in the community to contribute there. Just take a pause because I lost a train of thought there. I think the last thing I want to say about incremental progress, never having the shade of the tree that you plant in your lifetime, is there's something different for me about climate change compared to the other drivers of the fundamental research that I've done. The other kind of fundamental research I've done, you can think of it more like space exploration. Of course, we should be doing this as humanity. Of course, we should be learning about our place in the universe. And the fact that it's already very apparent that the climate on Earth is going to be irreversibly different by the end of my life compared to what it was at the beginning of my life means that I do think we need to be pulling the resources that we can into addressing that problem in the food system, in the transportation system, all over. But it also means we shouldn't be turning off the space exploration. So, like I said, I'm privileged to have worked in both. And I actually hope that many more scientists consider how over the course of their careers they can dabble in both.
I think that is a fantastic way to consider professional science as a career. Just like professional athletes get traded to different teams in the course of their career, we also can explore different intellectual pursuits. I feel like that makes us better scientists, and it sounds like you very much embrace that. And I think it sounds like it's made you an incredible scientist as a result.
Well, thank you.
I want to thank you for being on Food Truths. This is Dr. Sydney Schreppler from Savor, and you can find more information about Sydney and Savor in the show notes below. If you have any questions about this show, any topics you'd like addressed here, feel free to reach out directly. I'm your host, Eric Schulze. See you next time on Food Truths on the Spoon Podcast Network.